So in this talk, I'd like to ask a question: what is philosophy? One that philosophers really quite like to ask, but give it a particular focus because I think it's also an answer to the question of who was Socrates. Why is he such a seminal figure? Why is he someone we've all heard of and yet wonder quite what he's about? It might help to start by sort of giving a sense of how broad the word philosophy can be used, because in the modern world it is used in really quite a diverse range of ways, often I think to its detriment. I don't know what philosophy means to you. Maybe the fact that you're listening to this has made it as a bit of a self-selected group, but I think amongst many people philosophy means something dry, abstract, a bit intellectual in the mind, probably not very relevant, the kind of thing which some people like to do who are into that sort of thing, a bit geeky perhaps. And this is a very, very different sense of philosophy from what was meant in the ancient world when it first arose. Philosophy then wasn't just about tidying up a few bits of your logic. It was about nothing less than a transformation of your whole sense of self. That was really what the ancient philosophers were aiming for. So I hope that my answer to the question, was philosophy, who was Socrates, can really open that side of things up for you. So another way of putting this is that, broadly speaking, you might say there are about 5 types of philosophy that you can come across on the high streets today or in universities. If you go for an undergraduate degree in philosophy, certainly in the Anglo-American world, you're most likely to do what's known as analytic philosophy. So this is the kind of philosophy which sees itself as a kind of science. It's trying to pin down, hone down. It suffers a bit from what's sometimes called physics envy. It wishes it could come up with some results like a physicist can, the philosophical equivalent of Newton's second law of motion, F equals ma, something that is neat, tidy, captures a lot of the world, can be proven, is consistent, coherent. That kind of analytic approach is the one that dominates the Anglo-American world. If you go to university to do a philosophy degree, hoping to answer questions like what's the meaning of life, this kind of philosophy will probably not help you. A second type, pretty common in British universities, much more common in French and German universities on the continent, is known as continental philosophy. This one's much more, rather than logic and reason, this one's much more into sort of hermeneutics and interpretation. If analytic philosophy sees itself as a science, I guess you could say that this one sees itself more as an art. It's great figures of people like Camus and Sartre, who were great literary figures, as much as straightforward philosophical ones. They won Nobel Prizes for literature, as much as for their thought. And they would take old stories, make new ones, interpret them, enjoy the play of interpretation in order to answer questions about life. So it has a very, very different feel from analytic philosophy, and often the two are at loggerheads. When I did my philosophy PhD, members of the department on either side of this debate, I was told, often wouldn't speak to each other. They thought that what the other was doing just wasn't really even philosophy. That's how things, can get. That's something about academic philosophy. The third sort of philosophy, which I think is often around, moves more into the popular world. A first sort would just be philosophy as self-help. The consolations of philosophy would be one way of putting it. And this approach, I think, sees life as basically tragic. It's pretty meaningless. Things generally tend to go wrong, and it certainly ends up going wrong in the end. But what philosophy can do is offer you a few kind of practical tips and hints, consolations, maybe help you to make a good choice at least one day, even if you make loads of bad choices the rest of the week. So that's another kind of self-help sort of philosophy. It doesn't really aim to change anything, but just helps things to go a bit better. It doesn't aim to be a science, doesn't aim to be an art particularly, aims to be helpful, I suppose you'd say. If it can be helpful, then it will feel it's done its best. That's a third sort. A fourth sort sort of moves on a stage from that. This is more philosophy as therapy, you might say. So this doesn't just aim to be helpful. It does really aim to change you. And its key tool, it's not practical tips, its key tool would be noticing. It is more hopeful because it believes by just noticing what's going on in your life, life can actually very dramatically change. In the ancient world, it was really the Stoics that were the great advocates of this. They thought that you need to pay attention, for example, to the emotional flux of your life. And if you can, then a bit of a space opens up around that flux. And into that space, a new side of you can emerge, a new personality can emerge. And in time, you can really very dramatically change. So this is philosophy as a kind of therapy. It's quite common. It's really used in CBT as well. The founders of cognitive behavioural therapy regarded themselves as Stoics, and so it's been operationalised for the modern world too. This sort of fourth sort of philosophy. So in its own way, actually, it's pretty successful. But then we come to the fifth sort, and this is the sort that really is the one that matters to me, that I think is most apposite to asking the question, who was Socrates, at least? And this is philosophy not as just helpful, not as therapy, changing, but actually philosophy as a kind of awakening. The premise of this sort of philosophy is that there's a whole other world that, as it were, runs in parallel to this one, is embedded, is immanent in this one, but we're mostly blind to it. And this philosophy inspires you to open your eyes, to awaken, and see that life is really very, very different from what you assumed it to be. It's the philosophy most naturally associated with Plato. If you remember Plato's allegory of the cave, in it he says that what we take to be life is actually a bit like being prisoners strapped to the back of a cave. So strapped, in fact, that our heads are even held in place, and we can't even move them, though we don't even know because we never have moved them. And we think we see reality, but it's really just the flickerings on the back of the cave. In the story, what happens is that one or two of these prisoners dare to try and turn their heads, find that they can. It's very fearful, a troubling experience. It's always unsettling to turn away from what you take to be reality. But they look behind them, and they see first of all a fire. And in front of the fire are these puppets moving. And they realise that the flickers they'd seen and thought were reality were actually just the shadows of the puppets dancing on the back of the cave. The fire draws them, although it also frightens them. You know, it's kind of beautiful, but also seems dangerous. And they embark on this journey, the journey of awakening philosophy. The story goes that they move around the fire, and then they see another light, which surprises them even more. It's a kind of uniform, warm glow that seems steady and more attractive even than the fire. We know, of course, it's the mouth of the cave, but they get drawn towards that, as it were. They dare to get drawn towards the mouth of the cave. They step out, and to their utter amazement is a whole world that they had no idea about. They could sort of infer when they saw the puppets dancing in front of the flames that the flickers they'd seen on the back of the cave were sort of related. But when they leave the cave entirely, and they see a reality that they just had no intimation of at all before, this is the outside world, and then they notice there's another light, a third light. This one is so bright they can't stare at it directly, and yet somehow they sense that it gives life and light to all that they see now. It's the sun, of course, in the allegory, and it's also pointing to the divine light, which fills all things in Platonic thought. So these prisoners who have escaped from the cave have awoken, not just to more of themselves, not just to making life better. In some ways, it actually gives them a lot of trouble, this journey. What they've done is realise that life is completely different from how they saw it before. Plato remarks, actually, that often this awakening is also a kind of remembering that somehow deep in the heart of your soul, you did suspect that things weren't as you thought they were. You did sense that somehow there was a completely other side of life. You got it in the intimations of the beauty of the flames. You got it in the sense to want to strive and look elsewhere. And this is what the prisoners who escaped the cave, anyway, finally discover. Incidentally, at the end of the cave, the prisoners return to their fellows and say, look, what you think's the case is not the case at all. And the prisoners who are still locked up don't want to know. In fact, they kill the prisoners that return. Their allegories for Socrates, who, as you probably know, was killed by the Athenians. Anyway, so that's the fifth sort of philosophy, this kind of awakening. Now, Let me throw something else in that maybe makes some sense of why this perception of philosophy arose in about the 5th century BC, Athens. Something not dissimilar actually awoke elsewhere in other parts of the world. It's sometimes called the Axial Age. This sense that what humans must do is go on a kind of inner journey in order to discover the nature of reality. Sometimes said in China that Confucius and Lao Tzu, the founders of Confucianism and Taoism, respectively, that what they did was they embarked on an inward journey too. Different, because it was in China rather than around the Mediterranean, but nonetheless with parallels. And similarly, the Buddha and then the founder of Jainism too in the Indian subcontinent, they developed an inner version of what had been the Hindu religion. You know, if you know anything about ancient Hinduism, you'll know that it's full of strange sacrifices and rituals that were guarded by the Brahmin priests. And what the Buddha and others did about the 5th century BC too is nurture an inner kind of journey, meditation being the most best known part of that now. A similar turn to what was discovered by Plato and Socrates and the philosophers before. So what was going on then? You know, something did start to emerge in the 5th century BC, this Axial Age. Well, the person I feel is really helpful in trying to think about this is a chap called Owen Barfield. He was one of the Inklings, the Oxford group that most famously included C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, the great fiction writers. And both Tolkien actually and Lewis said that Barfield sort of had the best ideas. Unfortunately, Barfield wasn't such a great writer, so he's slightly hard work to get into. But nonetheless, he has a tremendous idea that Lewis and Tolkien developed in their own way. And broadly speaking, Barfield's idea was that consciousness changes, that the perception, he meant not in a Darwinian sense, but the sense that the perception of what it is to be human shifts over time. And in particular, a shift seems to unfold in about the 500 BC, 5th, 6th century BC. He called these different phases, sort of before then, during then, and sort of now after them, different forms of participation. That was his key word. By that he meant how we feel we participate in life, how we're embedded, how we share, how we experience the flow of life. And that sense of participation changes across this time. And it's that change that gives a rise to philosophy. So before, he thought that human beings experience what he called original participation. Now, this is a sense in which there's not really a sense of the individual, in fact, that meaning comes more from the outside world in rather than from the inside world out, which is how we tend to think of things. That there's not really a big distinction between what's inner and outer, what's mortal and immortal, between what's me and not me. Probably not a sense of the individual at all back then, which there wasn't really a sense of justice, for example. You know, the early bits of the Old Testament in the Bible would be like this too. I think it's one of the reasons why there's so much violence, it seems to us, in the Old Testament, is that there wasn't really a sense of the individual to feel justice for. Instead, tribes and groups moved as a whole and felt their gods moved with them. You see this in Homer as well, in the Greek world, that someone like Achilles, the great hero, he's sort of not really an individual, he's more like an archetype, and he gets moved by the gods. He also doesn't really speak to his inner life in the way that, say, Hamlet might do in Shakespeare. You know, Achilles doesn't stand up on the stage and deliver a soliloquy, sort of wrestling whether to be or not to be. What happens with Achilles is that he dialogues actually with different parts of himself. Achilles, the ancient Greek hero, will speak to his belly or will be led by his legs. It's like his body parts aren't a complete whole, but instead are spirited entities that kind of move of their own accord. In fact, there was no Greek word for a living body. The word soma, that came to mean a living body, actually just meant the kind of corpse when the spirited entities had left the body. The spirits, the gods associated with the legs, the gods associated with the eyes had kind of left, and then you had a dead body. So Achilles will say that his legs went for a run, or he put his armour on his skin, rather than putting it on himself or himself going for a run. Much more diffuse, dispersed sense of what it is to be human. You get it really very powerfully, I think, when you go to an Egyptian gallery in a museum and see lots of objects which really otherwise are very hard to make sense of. You might see little figurines with bits of human hair in them made of wax, or you'll see altars over which were poured libations. These were about influencing events, cursing people, and this kind of magic, really makes sense when you think of life as just a kind of flow and people as porous. They weren't encapsulated, defended against the outer world. They were immersed in it. And so to get a bit of someone's hair, for example, was to really have power over them. To know their proper name, similarly, was to kind of have power over them. You could inject spells into the atmosphere, which would then infect them. It shows up in all sorts of ways. Whole people get punished. Again, in the Old Testament, it says the man will be punished to the third and fourth generation. It's just pure injustice to us now. But back then, it was because there was no sense of the individual separate off, but that you were part of your tribe, part of your family, and your tribe and family could be infected, and that required a whole set of rites to depollute what the infection was. This is all facets of original participation, according to O.M. Barfield, which then start to shift. Now, why they start to shift is a very good question. Some people have said it's socioeconomics, that say in the Greek world, people started living completely in city-states, so they could make their own environment much more, live within their own environment much more. They weren't like nomads and hunters sort of moving through the natural world all the time, having to relate to the natural world all the time, without artificial environments. An artificial environment creates a sense of yourself. You sort of made it. You can become your own person in it. So perhaps that was one facet. I think that writing made a big difference too, actually, that writing had been around for a long time before this period, 5th century, 6th century BC, but it had been mostly a bureaucratic tool. It had been used to record taxes. But what happens about this time is people like Homer get written down, and so oral traditions become written traditions. It's the same in the Hebrew world too, that this is the time that the Bible first gets written down. And that very dramatically changes your sense of things, because sort of writing creates a sense that the meaning is in front of you, and you must conjure it from within yourself as you engage with the words. You must sort of bring the words to life yourself somehow. Whereas when you learn something by heart, you sort of receive it and then pass it on. There's a much more powerful sense of flow, inner and outer. If you've taken part in the play, you immediately have a sense of that when you've learned it by heart. It's very different from reading through a play to start with. So maybe the use of writing to record more religious texts rather than just bureaucratic texts had a big impact as well. Anyway, the point is that a kind of gap opens up. There's now a sort of me and a not me. There's more of a sense of an inner and outer. My mortal life feels quite different from immortal life. Questions of meaning come to the fore. Barfield called this a process of alienation, by which he just meant this sort of sense of separation, rather than just being immersed automatically in the flow. It has good benefits as well as the negative ones. The negative ones are the struggle with meaning, again, one of the reasons why philosophy gets going. But the good ones are the individual is born. Things like justice and conscience, free will, qualities which we take to be fundamental to what it is to be human, start to get going about this time. You see it in the plays of Euripides, for example, who was a contemporary of Socrates. Things like conscience and so on start to emerge in the Hebrew Bible. Eventually free will developing as well, something which we take to be essential to what it is to be human now. So there's this process of alienation. And what philosophy is really about is trying to reconnect, re-participate with the natural world, with nature, with cosmos, with the gods, without losing a sense of this individuality. So Barfield called it reciprocal participation. So the idea is that what's going on inside you matches, after the work of becoming a philosopher, what's going on outside. And this becomes a kind of awakening, where you don't just see reality in all its fullness, but you too yourself feel more real, more full, because there's this reciprocal relationship, very different from the original flow, where you were sort of less consciously pushed around, you might say, by the gods, by forces, by spells. So there's a real upside to this shift of consciousness, this evolution of consciousness, to a reciprocal sense of things. You see it when you look at Greek sculpture. One of the reasons why the Greek world is so fascinating, I think, is that this awakening occurs across about 100 years in the Greek sculpture of the time. If you take figures before about, say, 600 BC, they're archetypal, they're heroes who are sort of in between the gods and mortals. They're not naturalistic. They can have big heads, extended necks, not much interested in limbs. They're doing things like stabbing themselves. They often have large phalluses. This is about a vitality, a spirited sense of the body immersed in all sorts of forces that are flowing through it. Then what starts to happen is you get figures which are much more recognisably human, but they don't have an inner life. And these are the figures which are known as the kuroi and the kors, the figures of men, the figures of women. They have heads, they have necks, they have bodies, all actually to a standard proportion, a kind of sacred geometry. The same in Greece as in Egypt, in fact. So there's some sense of the individual, but it's still quite a collective sense of the individual. A kuroi or a kor is not Jack who lives down the road. It's a kind of archetypal man or an archetypal woman. And when you look at them, they have a sense of presence, but also a strange sort of blankness as well, because you're not looking into their soul in the way that we think to look into an individual now. But that does emerge just a few decades later with what we think of as the great works of the Greek age, where suddenly sculptures have an inner life and they look out at you. If you think of a figure like the Discobulus, the discus thrower, this is a body that isn't just perfect physically for throwing a discus, but is poised mentally for throwing a discus. When you see the balance of the body, you see the balance of the mind too, that's about to hurl the discus. Similarly, female gods will challenge you with their physical beauty for sure, but there's also a kind of intensity of their soul, a beauty of their soul that you're seeing in the beauty of their body through their shimmering robes and dresses. This is an inner life that's been projected, and it emerges really pretty quickly. It's normally called the Greek Awakening, over a period of about a century. And if you think about what it would have been like to live at that time, this would have completely woken you up as well. You'd have looked at a figure and perhaps discovered something in yourself that you just never realised was there before, your own inner life. And it was why sculptors were thought to be sort of semi-divine themselves, almost like magicians. They start to be named. We remember them by name. They're people with a perspective, conjuring up their perspective on life. One inner life speaks to another. Suddenly emerges about this time. Now, to bring it back a bit more to philosophy, I want to think about just a sort of few words which are used in ancient Greek philosophy and how they start to change their meaning as well. Very key words for Plato and Aristotle. So, for example, if you think about numbers, in Plato is usually interested in numbers for their quality rather than their quantity. So, for example, when he thinks about the number 1, he thinks about oneness rather than about the numeral 1 that's identifying one object. He's interested in what is it to be whole, what is it to be one, what is it to be round, perhaps, the quality of oneness. Two-ness would be very different then. Two-ness is about two things that are in a relationship, a sort of dyad, and they have dimensionality, 2 dimensions. What happens when two-ness becomes oneness? There's a very nice moment in one of Plato's dialogues where he imagines Socrates looking at raindrops falling and suddenly noticing 2 raindrops emerging into one. Now, he doesn't think, what's the volume of the one raindrop, having been 2 raindrops, which would be a sort of natural thing for us to think now. He thinks, what happened to the two-ness of those raindrops as it became one? Has there been a dramatic shift as a result of that? So numbers are really important in this transition, this sense of difference, and quality, which was Plato's natural way of thinking about things, becomes quantity in Aristotle. He actually invents the word quantity. He starts to want to add things up and feel his mind entering the numerous species and categories, more words that he invents, around him. How can he resonate with these many things around him? Are there kind of underlying principles that he can deduct from that? So he develops things on a step from Plato with this sense of perspective, individuality, by coining words like quantity. Another really important word for him is the word analysis, another word that Aristotle coins. And analysis is a bit like electrolysis. It means breaking something down to understand it. Whereas Plato had always thought about analogy. He tended to see things in the whole, and then wondered how one whole maps onto another whole, how an analogy in one part of life can speak to another part of life by sort of extension. So you begin perhaps to see how, from Plato to Aristotle, this new philosophy emerges by its engagement with the world. To quality is added quantity, to analogy is added analysis. Theory is another word that changes meaning as we kind of develop this reciprocal sense of things. Originally, a theory was a journey you went on, in fact, in order to have your perceptions changed. About now, a theory starts to be something that you're working through. So I think Plato thought of his dialogues as theories. They were experiences, a bit like reading a poem, you might say, that when you took them in, reflected on them, made them part of your own experience of life, they changed things. So a theory meant that for him. That's broadly what he means when he uses the word theory. It's different from theory being a sort of abstract proposition that can be tested objectively, which is how we tend to think of it now. They were interested in this reciprocal notion of theory, how your mind could fit, what needed to change in you in order to resonate with the outer world, and so awaken to it much more. Speculation, just one final word. Speculation was another really important word. It didn't mean, as it were, a punt on an idea. That actually was a word that didn't carry that meaning until the 18th century. Just in the modern period, in fact. Speculation back then was much more like spectacles. It was seeing. And so what the philosophers meant when they said we're learning to speculate was actually seeing into the depths of reality, seeing what was true, and not just, as it were, making a good guess and hoping it stacked up. So you have this emergence of the notion of reciprocal participation, and where my inner life can be tuned, can be trained through the practices of philosophy to resonate with the outer world, the external world. And I think Socrates, to come back to my main question, who was Socrates, is so seminal because in his very life he kind of constellated this. People sensed, even when they encountered him, that he had embraced this new perception of reality, of awareness, of consciousness, and was braving the alienation, braving the gaps, becoming more and more himself in order that he could then know more and more fully about the world around him. This reciprocal sense, the microcosm within himself could be aligned to the macrocosm without. It's very troubling, a bit like the prisoners escaping from the cave. This requires you to step out in a different way. And not many people wanted to undergo that, which I think is, broadly speaking, why Socrates got into so much trouble in the ancient world, eventually having to drink the hemlock and die. He upset too many people. This was too disturbing, a new perception of things. It didn't fit with the old collective senses, these individuals. Socrates said not that just he venerated Athena, like all Athenians did, but that he had a special connection with Apollo through a demon, a kind of angel figure that communicated Apollo's voice to him. A very individual sense of things which too many people found disturbing, too challenging. So he ended up being killed. But in his apology, in his defense, the speech that Plato gives him at his trial, possibly the earliest thing that Plato wrote about Socrates, he says some very interesting things. So I just want to read you something which tries to capture something of who Socrates really was. It comes in his apology, the speech which Plato gives him at his trial, where he attests to his life. And each word, as it were, almost carries kind of a rich meaning. So he says, first of all, well, let me read the passage out and then we'll talk through it. I have a divine or spiritual sign that began when I was a child. It's a voice, and whenever it speaks, it turns me away from something I'm about to do, but never encourages me to do anything. This is what prevents me from taking part in public life, and I think it was quite right to prevent me. So what's going on here? So first of all, he has a divine or spiritual sign. This is the voice of Apollo, the demon angel that spoke to him. It's within him. It's not shared. It's not accessed through the rituals, the libations, the rites, the festivals of the city of Athens. It's something which he knows personally, privately, you might even say. A divine or spiritual sign. Something really very new, very different that challenged people around him. I think it's very interesting that he says it began when I was a child. Now, nowadays, we have very developed notions of childhood development and realise that early life is really very important to who we become as adults. But that's not been assumed to be the case until really quite recently. And in Plato, you just begin to get intimations that early life tunes you into reality, or alternatively tunes you out of reality. And so you have to educate people really from a very early age, from childhood, in order that they can know what's good, beautiful and true, in order that they can awaken. And Plato's one of the first to start to write about this. And it seems that Socrates realised there was something in his childhood that enabled him to have this sort of personal, individual access to reality. So he says it's a voice, and whenever it speaks, it turns me away from something I'm about to do, and never encourages me to do anything directly. Now, this is very, very interesting too, because this is a negative way. The voice tells him what not to do, not what to do. A complete reversal of what you see in Homer, where the gods tell the heroes like Achilles what to do, if not actually force them to do it. They're much more like puppets. Whereas what this new relationship to divine reality is offering Socrates is a way of engaging with it that makes something of himself too. You know, the voice says, don't do this. So that immediately raises the question, what am I supposed to do? And Socrates, as it were, has to work that out for himself. He has to step into the unknown. He has to trust that something will emerge. And in that not knowing, his own sense of individuality develops. He's called to participate reciprocally in what the divine is unfolding in the flow that is immediately in front of him. So it's a way of sharing as an individual in what's going on in life, rather than just, as it were, being told what to do more ignorantly, less consciously. So that negative way, it becomes a really big feature of many, many wisdom traditions, actually, which is why doubt and skepticism and other parts of spirituality become so important. It's in those moments that you're actually called forth or to share in the spiritual life, to share in the divine life, as Socrates himself realised he was doing. And so the final bit he remarks on is how it prevents him from taking part in public affairs, and was quite right to do so. I think the point here is that this new inwardness, this new individuality, requires a kind of retreat from public life, at least at times, in order to cultivate it. If you spend all your life in the public square, you just get swept along by it. You can never have a sense of your own individuality. You need to step back from that in order to become yourself, you might say. Now, this too is a very, very different perception of things, because, for example, the word idiot that we use now comes from the ancient Greek meaning a loner. Someone who decided to step out on their own. They were thought to be idiots. Socrates was thought to be an idiot. But he knew something different. He knew that he had to create the space around him in order not just to be pushed along by the masses, by the collective, but to develop his own sense of things, in order then to be able to offer that back to the city. When he is finally condemned to die, he says, you'll regret what you're doing, because actually what I've got to offer is the greatest gift to Athens. And because it's going to use Barfield's phrase, it's going to help move the Greeks and ultimately many other parts of humanity as well onto a different consciousness that values individuality, but also has the opportunity to tune into wider reality as well, the microcosm reflecting the macrocosm. The great promise of ancient Greek philosophy captured in who Socrates was, because it was constellated, I think, in his very life. People felt it in his person, which is this notion of philosophy as a kind of awakening, as escaping the cave, and being able, even though we're mortals, to stare into the immortal sun, even though we're finite, to have a sense and taste for the infinite. And who knows, maybe even to transcend mortal life entirely, as I think Socrates came to the conclusion, and live in eternity with the gods.